Okay, our next topic is engage them. Engage them includes the module statements, more than questions, and response not required. Okay, and this is where it falls on our, whoops, I went fast. This is where it falls on our MasterPal framework. And the idea behind statements more than questions is pretty simple. Life is not a test, and we need to vary the way that we interact to create a dynamic that is inviting and interesting and that we want to sustain. So the thing about questions is that when we are persistently questioned, we're always on and we don't ever have, it can really interfere with a give and take and a back and forth. It can be exhausting and overwhelming. And in some instances, it can really cause a lot of pressure, unnecessary pressure. And that constant expectation of responding can also interfere with processing and comprehension because it may not always be easy to achieve an out. I think of simple, times when we're in a hurry and people are asking us a lot of questions and we respond and gosh, is it the most thoughtful response? Is it the most accurate way? Is it really what we meant to say? And that can be what happens when we're in a situation or in an interaction where we don't have a lot of autonomy over what's happening. So questioning also limits the quality of interactions. Um, the only communicative function or communicative intent that we can demonstrate when we're questioned is responding. There aren't always opportunities for initiating, for changing the topic, for expressing something different. And ultimately, responding is only motivating if the content is sufficiently motivating. So we can find ourselves really kind of backed into a corner and stuck in an interaction that doesn't move forward very easily if we rely on questioning. So again, we're back to this language development piece. When we look at typical language development, adult interactions with young children are varied. There are some questions. To be clear, this is not a bid to eliminate questions from our interactions. They're important. It allows us to shift the control over to another person and gain information. But we also see in more balanced interactions, we see lots of comments, which are statements. We see repetition and restating of utterances, which are also statements. We see adults that extend upon children's utterances and offer more information, and those are also statements. So a couple of really concrete ways that we can do this. We're going to talk about just to give a little information about this module. This is perhaps the longest module because it has lots and lots of examples of ways that you can use statements to enrich interactions, to extend interactions, to vary interactions, and ultimately to capitalize on lots of opportunities to provide language input with AAC. So a couple of these we're just going to take a brief look at. One of them is think aloud. When we think aloud, we self-talk about what we are thinking or doing or feeling. We take our turn. It's kind of crazy, actually. Adults have a really hard time taking their turn when they're interacting with kids. They want to encourage kids to take turns over and over, or maybe facilitate turn taking between two kids, but adults themselves are not great at taking, in my observation. So I think it's important that we take a turn, that we show kids how to use language to take a turn, whether it's in a game or sharing materials or really related to lots of types of interactions. Commenting is also wonderful. Commenting is always appropriate. Commenting can be commenting on something funny, something crazy, something new. Commenting is available to us at all times. So commenting is a really powerful way to provide language input and lots of social buy-in from commenting as well. And problem solving aloud. So when we problem solve aloud, we're thinking about, oh gosh, that's not what I meant to do, or oops, how did that happen? And giving kids language to talk about when things don't go well is also a really important part of developing their ability to process their world. So in some ways, you can think of it as just narrating what's happening, but then we do follow up with open-ended questions to provide them the opportunity to contribute to the interaction. Descriptive language is another example of a way that we can use statements more than questions. When we use descriptive language, we use describing words and action words. We use relational concepts. So those might be position words like in, on, under, or same and different. It also allows us to really dive into academic concepts and understanding extended, vocabulary. Uh, we do this sort of intuitively. If you have young kids in your life, chances are they've asked you, like, what does such and such mean? And when you reply, you probably use descriptive language to give a definition. So, if a child asks, like, what does habitat mean? My kids love Wild Kratts, which is a show that is all about animals and how they're adapted to their environments. So, to describe that word, we might say something like it's a place where animals live. It's a place that they are able to grow and find food and protect themselves. And those are all much more common words, but it's very descriptive. It talks about it. So we are able to invite participation with when we use descriptive language, we can then invite participation from kids by asking questions that are valid and meaningful, and that they're able to answer with the vocabulary we've modeled related to the topic. So these two ideas are explored in great length in this module. But here are some examples. When we think aloud, and we're playing a puzzle, we might say, I put all the same color together. Turn it, it will go in. Those bold words are our core words, and those are the words that are likely readily available on most robust communication devices. In the second picture, mom is helping with food prep, and she reaches through and says, let me get that. I will put it on the table. So just self-talk. Think aloud while taking your turn might look something like this. Mom and the little boy on the left are playing with pegs and a board, and she could say, my turn, I will put it in, as she then takes her turn. And the family that's coloring together, mom might say, or a sibling might say, I like green, I will make a turtle. Problem solving aloud, again, really important. The language around this first picture, a broken vase, might be, uh-oh, that is not good. And then you might tell the child, stop, don't move. That's how you can help me, is to stay where you are. Let's make sure we get it all. So again, giving language to those times when things don't go great. A lesser problem might be that the popcorn is all gone. And you could say, where is all the popcorn? It is finished. Who will get more? With descriptive language, shared reading is a really easy and fun and accessible opportunity to use descriptive language. I think often we have a tendency to label. So we might point to the pictures as we say girl, boy, tree, ladder, bridge, water. But it's so much more interesting to talk about what's happening in the picture. So use phrases like descriptive phrases in language. They play, he is high, up in the tree, climb it, go over, fast water. Then we're offering a lot more information and interest around the topic. So with statements more than questions, we do invite participation by asking open-ended questions. And these might be really general. What do you think about that? How does that make you feel? It also might be asking, specifically what was relevant to the child. Tell me something that happened. What did you learn about? Or asking them to think more specifically about how they could relate. What part do you find interesting? What are your ideas? Or what does that make you think of? Response not required dovetails really cleanly with statements more than questions. So these two bounce off of each other to really create such interactions that can really move forward, and really there's so much they're fun and they're informative, and everyone feels like they can contribute as much as they want in these interactions. So response not required, again, it has to do with the pressure and the demands that are placed on an interaction and whether or not an individual is prepared and ready to respond. So I think that, again, we can all relate to this. There are those times when you are asked to give a response or asked to provide information, and you're not quite sure what to do with it at that moment. You might say something like, I'm going to need to think about that and get back to you. So there is a misconception that AAC is an expressive tool, but more specifically that it's only an expressive tool. But the fact of the matter is that AAC facilitates receptive as well as expressive language, and we do need to use it receptively in order to develop those expressive skills. The next part of this is this challenge that expectation of a response is inherent in classroom discourse, and also, sometimes it's just the expectation within an interaction. However, ample modeling over time and across contexts without expectation of a response is inherent to language development. So when we recognize and when we really embrace the idea that statements allow us to provide lots of language input and that not requiring a response takes off the pressure, then we can provide that ample modeling over time that is needed to develop language. So the pro tip here is that you don't want to back yourself into a conversational corner. You want to ask those open-ended questions where the child has so many options about how they can respond, and you can attribute meaning to that. You want to use expectant pauses. So these are just long pauses where you're waiting, and expectant looks where you are anticipating and perhaps leaning in and letting them know, it's your turn. What do you have to say? I'm listening. It's also a time when you might observe and describe the body language or the situational factors and and determine if you need to give an out and be okay with giving an out. When you give an out, you might say something like, "You don't seem to have an opinion on this one. Let's check with a friend." Or, "I can see that you're thinking. I think you might be looking at." So perhaps to try to encourage or recognize their efforts, and then you can figure out what makes sense to fill in that blank. Is it more time, or is it more support? You might also offer your own opinion. I think that is scary, or funny, or interesting. You could also say something along the lines of, "You don't seem interested in this. Let's try something different." So recognizing when an out may be needed and then figuring out a gracious way to do that is an important part of response not required. These two modules together, the feedback that I often get is that this is really instrumental in shifting the way that people think about themselves as modelers. It gives them something really concrete to do that's actionable to shift a behavior that can really increase the amount of modeling and language input they're able to provide. So I think that this quote really reflects that. Change is purposeful. Being an effective communication partner or AAC facilitator is not intuitive, and it often requires us to change long established and unconscious ways of communicating. So, just to recap, we want to be a pal, think aloud, to comment, to describe, to explain, and extend, and then we're going to ask valid and meaningful questions to provide an opportunity for responding, but not require it, because communication is inherently motivating, and if it isn't, then it's compliance. So we want to give an out. We're going to model without expectation of a response, but give lots of language input around that, so we are building those skills.